country. So with those 6 principles in mind that we invite to be part of the rules of the game of this space, I hand over to Gwen for her to start formally this Embrace Dialogue Academia Seminar number 7. So over to you, Gwen.
Thanks very much, Andre. And on behalf of Roemos Diálogo and of Merton College, welcome today to this seminar. I can hear oh, sorry, that was my YouTube. I was checking in the background that the YouTube was working because someone was telling me it wasn't. Apologies. Welcome everyone today to this event, and I really couldn't agree more with Andre that this is an extremely timely event to be able to think a little bit about what's happening in Colombia today in light of the expertise of Francisco and his book and Jenny's comments. The title of the seminar today, as you'll all have known, is taken from the title of Francisco's new book, A New Cycle of War in Colombia, ? And the question mark is, I think, very important, but perhaps we will hear more about it in the course of today. Andrea's already introduced our speakers, and I think they need no further introduction. I'm sure you're all very aware of the important work that they both do as experts on Colombia and on Colombian politics and the peace process. And I'm not sure if you can find the book online through Amazon. Perhaps, yes. Francisco, you can tell us. Yes, it's available through Amazon. Okay, so also everyone is encouraged to buy the book as well. And this seminar, Embrace Dialogue Academia seminar series, is a series co-hosted between Roemos Diálogo and Merton College. And it's been running all throughout this academic year. And its purpose is really to create spaces of dialogue between academics who work on different aspects of Colombia, of peace and conflict in Colombia, from different disciplines, of different generations, and in different countries, including Colombians and friends of Colombia, in different universities around the world, to get together and share knowledge and ideas and think together about how academic research on Colombia can be useful in enabling a practical impact on the contemporary challenges of peace building in Colombia. And I think that I speak for all of those here today who are not in Colombia, that our thoughts are very much with the country, and on behalf of Roemos Diálogo, our solidarity with all of those who have suffered in the current crisis and protests, and those who've been experiencing all the forms of violence, both physical, economic, social, and psychological, of what's been going on in recent weeks. And those of us who are not Colombian, but who love the country very much, I know that our hearts are very much with the country these days as we follow what's been going on. And I hope that this space today will be a space that will allow us all to reflect and give us new input and ingredients to reflect collectively on how to think about the current situation of the country. So the way this is going to work is, first of all, Francisco Gutiérrez is going to give a presentation of his book for about 30 minutes. Then Jenny is going to respond with some comments about what she sees as the implications for this book, for contemporary challenges to peace building in Colombia today. And then we will have space for Q&A. So please do think up questions and comments that you'd like to raise with both Jenny and Francisco throughout their presentations, and save them for the Q&A section. We encourage you to participate. So if you'd like to ask your question yourself, please do turn your camera on and your microphone on when I give you the opportunity to speak. But if you don't feel comfortable doing so, you're also welcome to write it in the chat. Please be aware that this is being recorded and is live on YouTube. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded or being live, then perhaps better to write the question in the chat, either to me directly or to everyone in the group. But otherwise, you're definitely invited to be part of the dialogue. And without further ado, then I will pass over to Francisco, who is going to share his presentation and tell us about his book. Thank you, Francisco, so much for accepting this invitation. We're really, really honored to have you here today. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Are you hearing me? Yeah, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with Jenny and Gwen. And let me thank you also for your kind concern and solidarity. We really need it. Okay, so I will simply speak about the central ideas in the book. I of course don't have time to go into the details. Then respond to certain counter arguments that I discussed in the book, but others that have been eventually raised, and then propose some takeaways of this tragedy of the Colombian peace. Some more general takeaways, and that will be all. Before that, a small preamble, a small intro.
Francisco, could you put the presentation in presentation mode? That would be great. Thank you.
It's okay. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So first of all, I will assume some familiarity with Colombia. Second of all, I have to tell you that this book was not the conventional academic book, and where you have an idea that you really like and then you want to throw it to the world. Here I was, I had a more activist intention in mind, and wanted to, let's say, basically warn the society in which I lived in about the dangers we were facing. And third, I want to simply tell you that from, let's say, the point from where I am coming, because this is important when discussing this kind of questions. I have been a long critic of the FARC, of the main insurgency in Colombia. I spoke about kidnappings and denounced them when all my colleagues and intellectuals were speaking about retentions. I deplored very much the violence of the guerrillas, but I don't believe that the FARC can be reduced to a narco cartel or to a bunch of criminals. And I think that when throwing away the possibility of peace with this group and with all its experience, we were throwing away a very important voice, despite it being marred and contaminated by violence. Yeah, so this is basically the perspective. So, what is the core proposition I was issuing? I was basically, the idea was that the 2016 peace process was not being implemented, but instead systematically undermined, and that because of this, Colombia is facing yet another cycle of violence. So that this put us in the danger to fall into a new cycle of political war. Gwen, increasingly, I feel that the interrogation, we can dispose of it, unfortunately. Now, of course, none of the two clauses is self-evident, nor is the expression connecting them. So, before going into how can I substantiate that, a comment about the terminology and analogies. Colombia has had two big cycles of violence in the last 80 years. Of course, all these periodizations are open to contention, but this is simply a way to see it, a comfortable vantage point. So the first cycle was La Violencia, canonically known like that, the violence, which pitted the two main political parties against each other between more or less 1945 and 1960, something like that. Then we had another big hump, as you see it here, the counterinsurgent war. And then came the peace agreement. And as you see in this valley, these are artificially generated data. This is simply a heuristic, not true data. But this more or less corresponds to the evolution of homicides, massacres, whatnot. This is basically the structure of all these time series. In this valley, you can observe that there was a kind of pacification, between commas, between the early 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. So I am speaking about a double analogy. On the one hand, the analogy between the different cycles of violence and the situation in the present situation. And on the other hand, between this relative pacification that took place in the 1960s and the one that took place more or less between 2016 and 2018, when we had a more or less open window to make the transit to peace. And in the 1960s, there is already a very good literature about why did the guerrillas of the first cycle of violence of La Violencia, which were liberal peasants turned communists, accepted to go into the peace process proposed by the government. Basically, the claim of Hobsbawm, which I like very much, I would refine it a little bit, but I think it's very good. He explained that these were frontier communists who provided regulations in the agrarian frontier, and that they were very much willing to make a pact with the government as long as the government was able to guarantee non-violence and the provision of public goods. But then there was a political closure and a massive attack against these territories. And this opened the door, together with other factors, of course, this is not the only factor, to Colombia falling into a new cycle of violence, into this big hump. And here you have the analogy between the failed peace process of the late 1950s and early 1960s and today. And you see that it's not only the arguments issued against the peace process are very similar, but also even the second names, the surnames of the people who were issuing them. So today we have the sons or the grandchildren or the daughters of the same people who undermined undermined very effectively the peace process in the 1960s, doing the same today. Now, how can we say, or based on what can we say that the peace process is not being implemented? Of course, in the book, I give a lot of details because the situation was not so obvious as today. I think that the situation today has superseded some of the arguments of the book, because a lot of things have become rather evident. But even then, the first thing that has to be said is that evaluating, measuring peace implementation is hard. This is not obvious in the least. I think that the naive quantification is the worst way to go into this evaluation. I discussed this in detail in the book. I won't go to that here. So there was a lot of optimism around this naive quantification. But when one goes into the details, one can see that from the beginning, the Colombian implementation was deeply problematic. This was not only a thing of the far right, which is in the government since 2018. Also, the pro-peace government was in deep problems when facing the challenges of implementation. So the so-called comprehensive rural reform never was put into place. Presently, of the 3 million hectares, which is a very modest sum of hectares to be returned to the peasants, I think that only 30,000 have been delivered, not to the peasants, but to the governmental agency, which supposedly sometime will give it to the peasants. The participation point was rejected by the Congress. The same about political reform. In the crop substitution, we made a very careful evaluation of this with the research team that is working with the drugs and disorder project, which I very much recommend you to consult. I think the web page, or maybe at some moment I will send you the web page in the chat. And even the demobilization has started to have big troubles. So really, the only aspect of the substitution, or the only two aspects of the substitution that are standing in this moment, are the transitional justice institutions, the three of them that were created, and the delivery of the weapons by the FARC to an international agency. And the transitional justice institutions are the targets of the core activity of the government, of the party in government. So they are really being strongly attacked as being guilty of all the issues. So going to implementation in this graph, what I show is one could think about three concentric circles and an outlier. So the first concentric circle is the issues that were agreed that were indispensable to believe that there is any peace process set up out there. For example, that the ex-combatants are not killed, that they are not remobilized, etc., etc. The second, agreements that were agreed and that were transformatively, deeply transformative, like those related with the rural reform, the change between the change in the relationship between the central state and the territories, etc. And third, those that were agreed and desirable, like a lot of positive aspects of the peace process, which is very long, but that proposed a lot of positive transformations. And at the same time, here you see a couple of things that were not agreed, but that every single participant in this peace process, including a lot from the centrist coalition that signed this agreement with the FARC, and basically, and of course, its indispensable character we are seeing today was the reform of the police and the army. So simply the peace agreement didn't have the political clout, and actually not even the democratic legitimacy to discuss these things. Everybody understood that, also the FARC, but this had to be addressed at some moment. So in the book, I was over optimistic because I believed that the first concentric circle was basically there, so that the agreement was not flunking, but instead all the transformative, all the desirable things and the non-agreed but indispensable dimensions had not been developed. What we see today is that also the very core of any conceivable peace agreement, that is that the combatants are not assassinated, that they not remobilize, and that they have some capacity of participation in the public space, are deeply, deeply derailed. And the last thing I have to say about this is that there was a core promise behind the peace agreement by the ideologues, especially Sergio Jaramillo, the High Commissioner for the peace process of this agreement, which was, yes, we will abandon the reformist path, but we will change the relationship between the regions and the central state. This was really the core promise of the agreement, and the promise and the point of view from which the agreement has to be evaluated. But what we are seeing is that being very timid, we have a lot of negative results and risk factors. So the nature of, first of all, we have a massive remobilization. Like already in this moment in Colombia, there are already 10,000 people in arms. I have to say that I have met several specialists in each of these groups, people who know a lot and who have taught me a lot. And in many of these groups evidently have a political character. So on the one hand, we have the ELN, which is still there and acting. On the other hand, the so-called disidencias de las FARC, so the splinter groups that remobilized, and finally the successors of the paramilitaries. So I said from the beginning, and I stressed a lot this in the book, that the the new cycle of violence would not be exactly as happened with the second cycle of violence, the same groups. So in the second cycle of violence, it was maybe the same personnel, ex-liberal guerrillas, radicalized peasants, but the groups were substantially different in their ideology. They were communist guerrillas, not liberal guerrillas, and their forms of organization, even in their territorial presence. The same can be said about these ones. They have a different perspective. They are much less ecumenic. They have another kind of discourse. They have changed their military doctrine. We can speak about this. So there are a lot of significant changes, but in part they are the same personnel. And we also have the successors of the paramilitaries, of whom we can say exactly the same. A very important thing about remobilization, and I have to say it, which reveals the incredible stupidity of the present administration, is the pushing towards remobilization a lot of intermediate cadres of people who have the knowledge, the context, the skills, the capacities to make war. There's a very strong book by Sarah Daly Zuckerman, actually about Colombia, but it's more comparative, which shows that these intermediate cadres are fundamental to be, let's say, are fundamental to be able to set up a group that can survive. And at the same time, there was a lot of urban violence. I insisted a lot in that this new cycle of violence would have a very strong urban interface. You will tell me if I was wrong or not. And a lot of brutal state violence, which creates feuds, which creates deuda de sangre. How do you say that, Jenny and Gwen, in Spanish, in English?
Blood debts.
Exactly, yeah. Blood debts. So Latin America is a country that has the singularity that many of its dictators have fantastic phrases and sentences, aphorisms. General Rojas Pinilla said that Colombian violence was a combination of big hates and small passions, and he got it very right in that one. So with these blood debts, what the government has created is the conditions for massive recruitment. We have the evidence that these groups have the ability to recruit. Now, of course, causality relations are also always tricky. I am very much aware of this literature. I think that regarding these very conjunctural issues, we are condemned to be practical Bayesians. This means to adjust our beliefs at the rhythm that evidence comes in. And another caveat is, of course, that peace does not require justice. This is a little bit of Disney political sociology. Many times you have peace without justice. History has a lot of twists. I give kind of spectacular examples coming from from Latin America. But in this particular case, I think that the non-implementation, the sudden and brutal non-implementation of the peace accord will create the conditions for a terrible recidivism. So first of all, there are a lot of unresolved issues that all the theories that we know about the Colombian War are linked to political violence, both land and territory. And second place, the issue of illicit economies is completely unresolved, and also the issue of life and livelihoods of combatants. So we have a lot of incentives for remobilizations. But at the same time, we have to look at the political process. Let's say that there was a very naive interpretation by a lot of the forces that participated in the struggle for peace, thinking that this was an issue of tolerance, etc. I will go back to this in a moment. And they kind of disregarded the importance of Uribismo, which is the far-right coalition in Colombia, or the far-right political party or movement, which not only is the only force remaining in the Colombian public space that publicly legitimates homicide, but also that had huge stakes because of the political economy of its composition, because of its deep involvement with war economies, and because of its deep involvement with perpetrators to sabotage massively the peace accord. And this takes me to the limits of liberal peace. So once again, I have to be careful with the terminology. In the narrow sense, liberal peace is about international interventions, etc., etc. But in a broader sense that has already been admitted by the literature, is basically the theory that with the combination of marketization, democratization, and tolerance, and using a famous expression from Flaubert, I would say, sentimental education, countries could be adequately transformed and make successively the transit from war to peace. But what I have the impression is that the very characteristics that allowed the alliance that made the peace to create the conditions to arrive to a peace accord made it very difficult to implement the accord. First of all, because they had multiple audiences with different concerns. Second of all, because they were also deeply involved with perpetrators, with large cattle ranchers, etc., in the territories. For example, Santos's governance deeply depended on that. And also because the cognitive networks that were promoting peace-mongering, and of course, I was a peace-mongerer myself within my limits, etc. They set up a liberal narrative, which was, and this will sound very familiar to all of you, which was, it sounded very nice to the high middle class, which is deeply ghettoized in Colombia and to global networks, but that had let's say it didn't resonate as much into broad swaths of the electorate in Colombia. Here you see this man with the camiseta of the Selección Colombia of football. He is definitely from the popular sectors, and he has this cap which says, "I love Uribe." This kind of people were not in the mental landscape, and instead there was a lot of liberal posturing, which political leaders from all tendencies and all walks of life thought sounded very well, and that had sometimes no impact, sometimes very negative impact in different sectors of the population. So then came two very destructive events. The 2016 plebiscite, which the peace, which let's say was lost by the people who supported the peace accord, and which was really almost a death blow to the peace process. And then the 2018 election, which Iván Duque, the present president, won. And this showed a lot of deep misunderstandings, Gwen, and this, of course, speaks to your thesis, which will soon become a book, I expect, etc. I think there's still a lot to say about this. There was a deep misunderstanding about the social composition of Uribismo, both at the top and at the bottom. There was no regard for the Uribista constituencies. The Colombian Progress imagined that these people were living in a kind of permanent delusion. And there was, and the peace pedagogy that was done was very poor. Once again, I would quote Gwen's work, which is very eloquent in that regard. But besides below that, there are, let's say every peace process has deep tensions, but this one in particular had two very fundamental questions. The first one is how compatible is an egalitarian and social inclusive agenda with a peace agreement? So they must be compatible. I am sure that many of you are aware that there's a large literature out there that says that they can be. I disagree deeply with these. I think that you can show historically that this is not true. But there is a dynamic tension. It has to be taken into account. I think that very naively, through this liberal posturing, a lot of a substantial part of the peace, the pro-peace leadership, believe that all good things come together, as Albert Hirschman or Niccolo Machiavelli would say, and this is simply untrue. And another issue which has not surfaced very much, about which I speak in the book, but I have kept on working on this, is the deep links between the counterinsurgent discourse and the pro-peace discourse. They were intimately linked. This was disregarded. Even when you see the composition of the personnel that went in one direction and the other, there were deep links. Once again, this is not a surprise, but given the result, I think that we have to pay a lot of attention to this. Okay, so this is the core argument, and I will not go more into details. Now, the counter argument, some of the counter arguments. One is that the agreement was over-ambitious, and this simply is not true. This simply is not true. I was very surprised listening to academics, etc., saying that this was a fantastic thing, and that it was so massive and profound that it couldn't possibly be implemented in every detail. No, first of all, no peace agreement is implemented in every detail, but besides, the agreement was definitely not over-ambitious. I think it can be very easily demonstrated that it doesn't, by far and large, it doesn't stand up to the reformist standards of the 1960s Frente Nacional, which in the Colombian mental format is believed that is a very conservative experience. So this was basically a civilizational operation. For example, it promised to push forward the cadastre. So opposing the peace process in many senses was opposing the metrical system and basic measurements by the state. By the state, and precisely that's. I don't say it in the sense of sneezing at the peace agreement. I think that this made it precisely in its simplicity more fundamental. Another agreement as Colombia has changed. It's already past these immature things as war. Yes, Colombia has changed deeply. There is a huge historical distance between 1960 something, when these guerrillas were set up, in 2021. I go into detail. I will simply cite two data and an anecdote in the book. In the book, I of course give a more systematic substantiation. The first one is that the country is much older. This is a good thing for people who oppose war. Of course, young people, and in particular young males, are much less in the total proportion of the population. And the country is much more diverse politically, etc. So it's much richer, really. The anecdote I want to tell you that in 1974, President Lopez Michelsen named as a governor of the department of Risaralda a divorced woman. And the bishop of Risaralda said that this was a moral outrage, and that in the future we would have in the capital a homosexual as mayor. Well, today we have in the capital a homosexual as mayor, so he predicted well, but nobody seems to find that extravagant, etc. So the country has changed, and in many senses to the good. I have no problem with that. The issue is that war and politics have also changed, and it's perfectly conceivable to have a war and an ugly war in the present conditions. The second counter argument is about the evaluation of the implementation. Let's say that one has to nuance, etc., etc. So, in particular, I want to address two counter arguments that I have found once and again, not only in conversations, but also, let's say, in the public space, in the public realm. First of all, the idea that we Colombians are very impatient. So this was the argument mainly pushed forward by the international community. All of those of you that have read about Said's Orientalism will find this very interesting. Yet, so there's this stereotype that we are, let's say, like kind of nice hotheads. We love salsa, etc., but we are too impatient. I love salsa. I have to give you that. So definitely, I would be part of the argument, and of course we have our share of hotheads, and we have open, festering injuries. The problem is that this argument, which was, by the way, issued in a strategic, having a strategic objective in mind. Let's say they were trying to entice Duque to implement the accord, and then they were telling everybody, "Don't be impatient. Let's see how things pan out." But unfortunately, this argument went against all the evidence we know about peace processes. All of it. So the literature, I will simply give some highlights. The literature says that what is not implemented in the first 4, 5, 6 years is already not to be implemented. Second, the countries which have a very prolonged armed conflicts are very likely to fall once again in war. I think this is the only serious regression that Paul Collier made in all his life, but it still stands up to evidence. Third of all, liberal peace is not sufficient. This is the classic book by Roland Pearce in 2004. Fourth, one of the main issues related to recidivism is social and political exclusion after a peace accord. And this is the book by this gentleman, Charles Cole. And this is relatively recent literature, but there is a mass of literature about this. All we knew is that we were in a hurry. It told us in red letters that we were in a hurry. So I think that in this sense, this well-meant strategy was a failure, and it didn't contribute very much to and it rather played well in the hands of the governmental strategy, which was to pretend it was implementing the peace process to the international audiences and instead derail it in Colombia. And a lot of people have told me, which is a kind of inverted Orientalism, that, yeah, but Colombia is different. We are the country of magical realism, but I highlight in red here, yeah, but of realism. So the second word in that expression is realism. You can't operate with total disregard of the facts. The third counter argument is the nature of the third cycle. So I basically will address like the two main ideas. First, this is not a political violence that what we are seeing in Colombia. This argument has been issued also for this massive wave of protests and confrontations. This is not too plausible. Of course, we don't know very much about the about the nature of the new groups which are popping up. And besides, we are in this kind of volcanic situation in which some groups appear, others disappear, etc. But what we know, and of course there is a very mature group, which is the ELN. What we know is that these groups are deeply political, that of course they are related to the illicit crops economy, etc., and to other illegal economies. but they cannot be characterized by the plausibly as criminal. And besides, we have a long tradition. I think this is is in the top 3 of rhetorical hits in the Colombian history, and I think in many others, to say that all these rebels are only bandits, only criminals, etc. This was a fundamental discourse during the first cycle, during La Violencia, also during the second one. But eventually, they had to negotiate. And the other one, which I would have wanted to develop much more, and an issue in which I am working with, is what has happened with the changes in war. So, of course, societies have changed very deeply. Between 2005 and 2008, this changes a little bit depending on the source. But between 2005 and 2008, for first time in history, the human society is more urban than rural. So, of course, this has a huge incidence. We are also under the weight of massive technological change and consequently of new political challenges. So I simply want to highlight that I treat this in the book. And the conclusion is maybe some aspects, and that's why I put the flea. So the classical guerrilla, which was christened by Richard Taber as the War of the Flea, may be subject to some process of obsolescence, but this doesn't mean that violent contestation is a thing of the past. And I will end, if I have time, Gwen, I think that I am a bit late, but this is the last slide. I don't know if I can continue.
Maybe just wrapping up in 2 minutes, Francisco, that would be great.
Okay. So I would simply highlight 4 analytical and comparative takeaways. The first thing is the limits of the liberal peace. This has been discussed, but I think there's much more to discuss. In particular, the issue and the role of some liberal conceptions of peace and the issuing of the plebiscite and the deep misunderstanding of the anti-peace vote. So I think here, and of course, this can resonate with Great Britain and United States, many other countries at different levels of development. I think the issue of obvious voting and the failure of the people to engage in obvious voting and what intellectuals seems that are easy choices needs a deep and detailed consideration. The second issue is about the changing nature of civil war. The third is the reasons to mobilize from above and from below. There's a big asymmetry in the literature, which considers mainly the reasons to mobilize from below, but as we Colombians have learned the hard way, there are also strong reasons to mobilize violently from above. And finally, I think using another expression that was developed in the context of the Drugs and Disorder Project, we are, let's say, peace mongers face tough trade-offs. Not all good things come together. Many a times the qualities and capacities that allow you to give life to a peace process block its implementation. And also you can see this at the very micro level in terms of quality of life. I would ask you to think deeply in life trajectories like those of the FARC women combatants. These women were, the FARC was a deeply feminized group, and many of these women hailed the peace process enthusiastically. Actually, the new wave of groups is much more masculinized. So I think we have evidence that women left the war, or at least this particular war, But what has happened with their life trajectory? Has peace treated them particularly well? I am not so sure. And jumping once again from the micro to the macro, also the issues of the relation between equality and peace have to be considered carefully. And I will leave it there.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Francisco, for this presentation. And Jenny, I will pass over to you. I think you have a both very easy and very difficult task because the implications for policy today are so massive, but also so multiple. So I look forward to hearing your comments about the implications of Francisco's book for contemporary peace building challenges today.
Yes, thank you very much, Gwen, and thank you very much, Francisco. Very important perspective on what is going on in Colombia. And many people, I think, began this year extremely worried about the peace accord. And then Francisco's book came out, and I think those who read it and liked it very much were also very, very much more depressed by it. Right? But I tend to think that Francisco's book is a perfect example of the much quoted Gramscian view of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? And that need to confront reality if we're going to act, and if we're going to act to salvar la paz, you know, which is part of the thread of Francisco's book. How are we going to save that peace, rescue that peace? And I found the book is never about inevitability or determinism. And I think that Francisco and I share a love of the word contingency. And it's why I particularly love this book of Francisco's, because at one level it's a cri de coeur, but it's not a manifesto or diatribe, as he puts it. And at the other level, it's a very thoroughly informed analysis of the potential dangers of a third cycle of violence if there is no action. The question is, what action? And I don't suppose Francisco, though he might have, but I don't think anybody quite predicted that the 28th of April, we were going to see this paro nacional and the violent police and military response. And it's made it clear that people do act, but how do we connect this social uprising of the paro with the prospects of the peace process and the questions that, that Gwen and Odiamos gave me for this brief intervention? I think it's very hard to sort of comment on the book without taking on board what's happening at the moment, and not to connect what it tells us about the possibility of a third cycle of violence and the issues that Francisco raises. And in the book, Francisco at one point makes a great analogy between the researcher and the alcoholic, that once you've been one, it's difficult to stop being one, right? So as an alcoholic researcher, both literally and conceptually, I very much welcome this commitment of Francisco to opening up the debate in a form which goes far beyond our own academic addictions, right? Our addictions are our intellectual obsessions, which make it so important for the researcher to share what is in his or her mind, and precisely to open up debates which cannot take place only between the addicted. We must communicate with the wider world, however complex our ideas. And Colombia has produced an incredible body of intellectual thought. But I've always noted when I go to Lerna, how rarely you'd think if you go to Lerna, well, you know, Colombia has resolved the problem of peace because there's such a fantastic intellectual productivity. But I think what Francisco has done is to say, well, you must connect at some point your ideas and your analysis with people on the ground. And I think that's what he's trying to do with this book. And I particularly liked his archaeological approach to rescuing the peace accord. In fact, I called my notes Arqueología del Salvamento de la Paz, because this digging into the past is so vital. We cannot ignore it. And in my digging, and with the help of Francisco's own excavation, I want to just say three things about the peace accord and the social uprising of the paro, hoping that this addresses to some extent the question that I was given. So the first point I want to make is a bit controversial. I don't have time to found it, to justify it, but I do believe Colombia is a state without a nation. So the temporalities and character of the formation of the state of Colombia have been built on an exclusionary logic. And that exclusionary logic was once mitigated perversely by the way the two traditional parties brought the poor behind and into their battles, right? And then through the Frente Nacional, the National Front Pact, and the transactional politics of Bogota, when clientelism fueled by drugs money was a way to ensure the ongoing votes and political power of those traditional parties, that meant that, that actually there was a historical period when the state existed, but it was a state that really did not bring in people into that sense of national belonging. And for some time now, and Francisco has documented this in other books he's written, we have seen the end of that bipartisan Bogota politics of the country's elites, and the rise of the regional elites and new actors fueled by the illegal economy and paramilitarism. So it's not just, as many people put it, that the state is not present in so many parts of Colombia, it is that other actors are. We are living the deep-rooted crisis of the historic Colombian social, economic and political order, and its capacity even to be an order, in my view. My second point is that the peace accord of 2016, as many authors I think would argue, has to be seen in the context of the varied efforts at peace in the country. And I think Francisco does go into this to some extent in the book. But I think there's a sort of another archaeology in that process of like looking at these various efforts to think about peace, which are much richer than I think is often recognized. And I remember writing something at one point about how we had a violontología, as you know, the viontologists. I feel we need pasologías, una pasología, something that's actually going to do the equivalent. But that violontología is actually extremely interesting. But if we look at the 2016 Accord, we see that the fragmentation of the elites that I was suggesting in my first point has accelerated. And the problems facing the Uribista project in particular, I would say that that project is facing a crisis. That's one of the things that really is going on at this particular moment, because he needed the FARC just as the FARC needed him. And when I finished a book that I've just written on politics and violence, I look back and I thought, did Carl Schmitt win the 20th century, right? So Carl Schmitt wrote just before the rise of Nazism and bought into that project. And he said, the state becomes political when it identifies with the enemy. Well, the problem is that the Colombian elite now don't have the enemy in the same way, partly due to the peace accord, right? And so other issues have come to the surface, the long gestating problems of the country that were never dealt with by the elite pact of the National Front period and all that happened after that. So my third point is that I've always been struck by the way that the social struggles in Colombia have been swamped by the political and military ones. So perhaps many of you have done this, but I went back to the 1977 first Paro Nacional, which is extremely interesting. In fact, there were 128 local and regional paros between 1971 and 1980, right? These are the social stoppages. Sorry, I'm assuming people know quite a lot about Colombia, but that's what they are. It's a national stoppage equivalent to what's happening in the last days. Well, that national one in 1977 was organized by the trade unions. This was not a militarized struggle or stoppage. There was a real social effervescence at that time. But when Turbay came to power just in 1979, and he took over the presidency, his first reaction was to repress, right? So we had the security statute that enabled him to imprison, torture many people who were involved in social struggles, not in the armed struggle. That difficulty of the social struggle to find its space in between the state repression, but also the armed struggle took new dimensions in the 1980s after the failure of those social struggles. And I think that's quite important to sort of remind ourselves of. And given the failure of the elites to implement the peace accord, and I agree totally with the analysis that Francisco has given of that failure of implementation, But I would say that the Accord has nevertheless opened up, ironically, strangely, a space for that social protest to come up again, right? So this is why there's a crisis of the elites in Colombia at this moment in time. It's because there is a fragmentation of the project and of the elites. There is not a project for the country. And what we have is these social activists. We don't know whether there's a project there. We don't know whether the left can articulate that project. We don't know yet how it will connect to other attempts to define the country going on in the countries that are more violent. I mean, I'm struck by how this hasn't been a violent social protest. There has been, as we know, there's been vandalism, there's been things that have gone on. But generally speaking, this has been an incredibly peaceful and an attempt to really put new issues on the agenda in Colombia. And so the question for me now, and it's a very worrying question, is will this push through the ever postponed agenda of serious reform that the Accords began to put on the agenda? You know, they began to say we absolutely have to have an agrarian reform. We have to have a different attitude towards political participation, etc., etc. Francisco has dealt with this. And the Accord was based on promoting some of that. So will we see through this social activism some of that, or, and this is my great fear, will the state and private violences return to repress social action for change and pave the way for the new cycle of violences that Francisco is talking about? There are already indications of some death squads. I'm hearing about actors that are looking to more private violences, as well as the fact we know the military and the police have used violence. So sorry to end on a question, is this, where do we go kind of thing? But I think that's in the spirit of the dialogue that Francisco has opened up for us, right? Faced reality, I remain someone committed to optimism of the will to look for the contingent possibilities for change, but I'm also extremely worried about what's on the horizon.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you for fitting so much into a short space of time. That was really impressive and really interesting. So I now want to open the space up for questions and comments from the audience. If anyone who would like to speak would like to use the raise their hand function or just write me or something in the chat, then I would be happy to offer you the chance to speak. And I won't take my chair's privilege because I see there's already a hand up. So I will, Andre can ask the first question, and please, those of you who have questions, do let me know. Draw my attention in some way. Andre.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Francisco. Fantastic presentation, really thought-provoking, and the comments by Jenny, really, really good. Francisco, I think I want to sort of ask you two questions. Let me just sort of try to phrase the first one. The first one is, I was, in 2019, in a seminar that we did at LSE with Jenny and with Gwen, we posed a question after Ivan Marquez decided to go back to take up arms. So we were in the middle of this crisis, and we asked the question of when would we say that the peace process has failed? And it seems that to some extent, we are now talking about that we finally can come to terms with the fact that we failed. But, when we were having that discussion, I was constantly thinking about the experience of Tiro Fijo and Jacobo Prias Alape, because one of the reasons why Tiro Fijo went back to take up arms in the late 1950s was after they killed Jacobo Prias Alape, and then he felt that the spaces for reincorporation or DDR had been closed, and so he just went back and to Tolima and joined the self-defense groups, which for me was the big sign of how somehow, the role of Ivan Marquez and Santrich was like history repeating itself, and was really creating this idea of we were just like seeing this happening in front of our eyes. With that in mind, I want to ask you the first question that has to do with, you are saying that a question mark of we are in a new cycle of violence probably, and now you think that the question mark is less and less relevant. But what would happen in 2022 if a government by Uribismo is elected in the presidency of Colombia? Would we enter into the next phase of that new cycle of violence? What would be that new phase of that new cycle of violence be like? I think I'm pushing you a bit in terms of that to see a bit in terms of the future. And then the second question that I wanted to make has to be with the idea of, has been discussed quite broadly in Colombia in the last 2 weeks, and is how the right is so powerful in creating new enemies or new scripts that install emotions in people. So whereas during the Cold War, we have this fear of Marxism-Leninism that was embodied in the FARC. And in the middle of the peace process with the FARC, the idea of Castro-Chavism was created to have fear in the outcome of the negotiations. Now, Uribismo and some sectors are talking about the molecular dissipated revolution. And that the idea is that anyone who is engaged in identity politics is a potential threat to the nation. And now the new referent is not Marx anymore, or is not Chavez anymore, but is Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, theorists who have inspired a really important agenda that comes from gender, decolonization, and transformation of unequal structures. So if that's the case, how do you think we can counterbalance that sort of a script that probably is going to capture the imagination of a sector of Colombian population and is going to move them towards the right instead of towards the reformist agenda that Jenny Pearce was talking about?
Thank you, Andre. We have also a question written in the chat by Borja Palladini, but I don't know, Borja, it would be lovely to see you. And if you would like to turn on your camera and ask the question yourself, you're very welcome to do so. Hi, Borja.
Hi everybody. Nice to see you all. The questions is probably a bit impossible to answer, but I would like to know from your understanding, Francisco, what are the main obstacles that impede a quality and transformative peace to emerge in Colombia? Thank you.
Thanks, Borja. And perhaps I'll ask my chair's question for the final one in this round, and then we'll go back to Jenny and Francisco and allow people to gather their thoughts for any questions in a second round. Francisco, I'm really pleased to hear your presentation, and of course it sounds to me like you were writing a story of a crisis foretold, right? I think it's we were saying before we started the talk that it's very sad, but yet nonetheless somewhat satisfying as a social scientist to be able to say I told you so, to write something and have it come so and have it be so prescient as to see this kind of crisis unfolding as it is now. And of course, I mean, the saddest thing is that if the peace accord had been more implemented in point 2 in particular, people would be feeling that they had more space to participate both through social protest, but also through other kind of political participation and social participation mechanisms. And of course, the return of the paro is one of the results of that. And I never forget the sort of selfishness of the elites of shutting down the circunscripciones especiales, the special circumscriptions for people to participate in Congress who were not politicians, but people from the regions most affected by the conflict. So I think that, you know, it's really important to draw the line between the poor implementation of the accord and the crisis that's happening today. My question is about the role of academics in this context, actually. And I was really pleased to hear you at the beginning say that you had written this book not in the normal way of an academic kind of analyzing a phenomenon, which is of course something that you do in your other work, but also as a sort of a project that had a bit more of an activist or a political agenda behind it, which was to call attention to the failing piece or the flailing piece and the need for action. And I wonder what role academia plays in making such calls. This is a forum in which we try to consider the role of academia in peacemaking and peace building. Jenny obviously has referred to the peaceologists, the extraordinary work that is coming out of Colombia now, that was focused on the peace accord. Do books like this help call attention? Do they engender action? Do they promote consciousness? You are a very prolific public intellectual in a tradition that we don't have as much of in this country as I would like to see, but in Colombia is very active, of academics who write in journalism and write media columns and try to influence public opinion. And I always find that very admirable and important. And I would love to know what you think about how academia could help today in the current crisis, which is so heterogeneous. The protests, the demands are so widespread. There's no one single demand, they're multiple, and the sectors mobilizing are so multiple. And how can academics play a role in helping to articulate or connect the heterogeneity of demands and find a way forward through this sad conjuncture, but a conjuncture that also sort of has openness as crisis, as Jenny mentioned, openness that perhaps was not there prior to the peace process. So open-ended questions for you there. And perhaps we can return to you both. Francisco, you can respond to these questions in any order that you like, and picking up on the bits that you find interesting.
Perfect. If Jenny wants to go before, Jenny.
No, you, Francisco, definitely.
Okay.
You're the star here.
No. And I will be very brief. First of all, I have to make a disclaimer. When I am not prolific, I basically write my column. I think it's the best paid job in my life because it saves me paying a psychiatrist. So I write it only because of that. It's a kind of public expression of the feelings that I can't air in other contexts. So yeah, but I would synthesize the answer to your question in what Jenny said, in the Gramscian expression of optimism of the will, pessimism of intelligence. This means be very careful. Say whenever you don't know something, I don't know. I think it's the best expression an academic can use ever in any context, and particularly in this one. And at the same time, let's say differentiate very much in which capacity are you speaking. If you are speaking as a citizen, or if you are offering an expert opinion, and then in what does that expertise consist? I think, let's say, building on what Jenny and Andre said, that there's a lot of very positive peace building tradition in Colombia. And I think it would, let's say, to answer seriously your question, Gwen, and I think this can be undertaken actually by Rodeemos el Diálogo, or by a network of researchers. Let's say the multiple ways in which intellectuals, experts, academics have participated in Colombian peace. I think they have had a role, of course, taking into account that a peace process and war involve a lot of forces which are national, global, etc., and that which can easily crush you as well. So it's a participation with a lot of limits, but people have disregarded those limits and have gone. And I agree totally with Jenny, quite admirably, much more than me. I have been, because I happen to believe in the ivory tower, a little bit at least, Jenny, but a lot of people have offered their lives to defend peace and to defend popular sectors in Colombia. So I think this, let's say this deserves a careful consideration. But one thing I would say is that, let's say, responsibility, seeing being very clear, not building illusions, not and offering your expert advice to positive forces of change whenever you can. I think this is the basics, but one can go much beyond that, and that would correspond. And I would really suggest, Gwen, maybe your network, Andrea and Gwen, can pick up the idea and make a serious reflection about this. This deserves a separate consideration. With respect to the question about obstacles to constructive peace implementation, yeah, I would be tempted to use the formula. I don't know, as you highlighted, but I think there are some tips, and I think this experience shows us a lot of things, actually a lot of things that academics can do. So on the one hand, we had, of course, a lot of political restraints. The coalitions that make war in Colombia are not only national, are global. Think about the drug or the coca economy. There you have a massive participation by global markets, the United States government, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say the building and the sustainability of those large coalitions is a very complicated issue. This is a first thing. I think also we face some cognitive limitations. Making peace is objectively difficult, and making peace for a country like Colombia, in which a lot of the problems were rural and the country is already urban, in which we have a heritage of 50, 60 years of war, et cetera, is objectively complicated. So once again, going back to the optimism of will, this is not the moment to be disheartened. This is the moment to build the cognitive technical capacities to be able to try again. If you see the history of aviation, you see that they made like 1,000 attempts before the ultimate success. This happens with sticky social problems like racism in the United States, etc. You have to try once and again until you find the breakthrough and ways of improving the thing. So yes, this is definitely not to being disheartened, and we have to find the obstacles. I think there's also another issue which the peace process didn't address so clearly, which is the problem of property rights over land and its deep association with the private provision of security. And this is linked with the problem of state formation, indeed, et cetera, et cetera. But I will not go into that because it will take too much time. And regarding Andrei's two questions, I think the parallel he makes is really good. Speaking about this experience of Tiro Fijo and Jacobo Prias. Actually, Tiro Fijo, during the Paz Criolla of the Frente Nacional, became a small-time bureaucrat. He was Inspector de Carreteras. How do you say that thing in English? Road inspector.
I don't think we have an equivalent, but
yeah, road inspector, maybe it would be
police road inspector.
Exactly, something like that, and he was very happy actually. And I want to reinforce this one with another anecdote, but which is telling. During the peace process, my university made a census of ex-combatants, and I had a student, a very good student, very brilliant, who had different connections with the FARC, etc. And he obtained an interview with El Paisa, Andrei, El Paisa, which is the leader of I think the FARC team with largest firepower in all the FARC history, which was the Columna Móvil Teófilo Forero. And El Paisa, he spoke. El Paisa didn't allow him to record the thing, but he spoke with him, and El Paisa said, "Look, I know I am busted because the bourgeoisie will not will not pardon my the attacks that I have made. He's the guy who made the attack at the Club El Nogal, etc. But I'm willing to go into this process, despite the fact that I think I am busted. And this guy was systematically pushed back into insurgency, systematically, and you can show with the other people who you mentioned. So here there was a fair deal of irresponsibility and of hubris, and these people know how to make war. They know very well their business. And regarding the thing of the Uribismo, so yeah, Uribismo has a fair chance of winning 2022. It's not clear. Let's say I think it will lose the Congress. I think it can still win the presidency. I have made actually a little bit of analysis there, and as you say, Andre, it's in a sense a rebellion to this modern world of a lot of that, let's say, escapes the control of Uribismo. In the midst of this confrontation, a video of a neo-paramilitary circulated, and he was masked, and the guy was speaking not against subversives. Andre, I think the poor guy wasn't aware of wasn't aware of Deleuze or Guattari, because he was a rank and file combatant, but he was speaking about against men with earrings and effeminate men and all these horrible discourses and the destruction of the morale, etc. Actually, I made an electoral analysis, and it is clear that Uribismo has been kicked out of the large cities. So in the main cities, including Medellin, Uribismo is already a minority. In Cali and Bogotá, it's an abject minority, but it still has a hold in different territories. So let's say this will be complicated. Of course, I don't want to suggest that simply the Uribismo is a force of pre-modernity fighting against the representatives of modernity. The Colombian society is much more complicated than that, but it's an issue. And as you say, Andre, they have been able to build a lot of emotions here. I would highlight three things. First of all, the sheer quality of its leadership. The Uribe is really a brilliant leader. I think modern social science lost a lot of things that were already in Machiavelli, and that allowed him to speak about the quality of political leadership. I think this is absolutely fundamental to understand any political process. This guy is extremely able, and he knows, he has a hold of the legal and illegal world. So what he claimed like 10 years ago of being indispensable, I think he is indispensable in the sense that he is the only link between the legal and illegal elites, which is a fundamental link for Colombian stability in this moment. So first of all, there's an issue of capacity. Second of all, there's an issue of the content of the policies. I think the opposition was unable to address a key issue which Uribe did address, which was security. A lot of workers in the cities have deep security and genuine security concerns. So there he didn't have a strong competition. And I think in the third place, as you highlight, he was able to create a lot of emotions, not fear, on the other hand, deep loyalties, and on the other hand, let's say kind of paternal discourse of protection, which had a lot of credence in some sectors. There's much more about this. Of course, these three questions, Gwen, are impossible to answer. But
no, you've done very well and very comprehensive. I wonder if Jenny would like to pick up on any of the threads raised by Francisco, or speak to any of the questions.
Very quickly, because I see a lot of hands and a lot of questions coming. I just wanted to pick up on this theme of Uribismo's loss in the cities. I mean, very significant to me in Medellin, and what this means, because it's the first time that I could recall that we have the possibility of an election in 2022 where it might be the centre and the left, right? And obviously we can't predict anything. The right could regain its strength, there's no doubt about that. But I think that's exactly where I respond to the question that Andreas raised, because I too sort of noted this molecular revolution and that of Gutiérrez, and that the army in Colombia have been trained by a neo-Nazi in these ideas of where the revolution and the destabilization is going to come from. And it's very significant, I think, that they are, looking at all these changes that have taken place. And it's not just in Colombia, is it, that there's a backlash? We would not have understood what Trump represents or what's happened in the United States if we hadn't understood that, Black Lives Matter had put racism on the agenda in the United States as never before. And so, I think very interesting, Francisco mentioned how there was a misunderstanding of the kind of how people were going to respond to the peace process with the plebiscite, and the fact that gender ideology as a sort of tool of the right and of the evangelicals was going to have such an impact. And to me, this is the search for the new enemy that would unite the elites again, right? Particularly the right. And so for me, it's particularly dangerous. And it's why this kind of movement for change, that I think is showing that also, new voices have come to the fore in Colombia in a way not before. I mean, the Ruta Pacifica, I think, has just brought out a paper about how women are experiencing the Paro Nacional and the repression. And so we're now sort of hearing, we mustn't, we've gone back to history, we've done the archaeology, but also there's all these changes in who acts, who organizes, where are the voices, the indigenous communities, etc., that played quite a very interesting role in Cali and what's gone on there. So it feels to me this is another aspect of the crossroads, right? Is, will there be a reconfiguration of the elites around some new enemy, or will these new changes start to connect with the population in a new way? And you could never take that for granted, because I think just as we have these social organizations protesting, demanding and recognizing the impact of COVID differentially on the poor, all those issues, the lack of services, etc., there's always the possibility of what I call authoritarian citizenship, which is the appeal to sense of insecurity, to say, I'll deny the rights of others because the right is offering me security. And I think that's what a card that the right has played so much better than the left.
Which is already happening. If you read the recording of this call that was recorded of the business sector and the right, they were talking about arming themselves and legitimate defense strategies where the state was failing and so on and so forth. Francisco, I'm aware that we've reached the time, but I've got two more questions here. I don't know if you would be able to take two more questions, have time for two more?
Perfect, two more questions.
Two more questions. Okay, so Grace has written, but Grace, would you like to turn on your camera and ask your question yourself? We'd love to see you and say hi. Hi, Grace.
Hi, thank you so much for those really thought-provoking, if quite sobering talks, but I really appreciate the profundity of the analysis. I wanted to focus perhaps on the possibly more uplifting or inspiring elements of the protest, even though there's so much to be concerned about. But just reading, about the popular assemblies involved in the protest, they reminded me slightly of what was going on in Chile. I don't know if that is a fair comparison. And I was also hearing about the organization of barricades in Cali and getting food to the barricades and organizing that. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about, who are those? Are they new forms of popular organization? Who's involved? Are the different cities in touch with each other? Do they form the basis of a new project, or how do they link to the existing social movements? I'd just be really interested to hear a bit more about what's going on in these protests and how they connect.
Thank you, Grace. And then Dara, you've got your hand raised.
Hi there. Yeah, I'll be very quick. A few things. Just to agree with a bit of an analysis of Jenny, I think the whole gender ideology, I totally agree, was a way of finding a new common enemy. So I think that's a really good piece of analysis. And what Francisco said about the things that don't get implemented straight away, possibly never get implemented. I think Northern Ireland, where I am and I'm from, is a great example of that. So just this week, there's kind of finally a massacre that happened in 1971 has been kind of clarified that the people killed had no connections to paramilitary organizations, and it's taken 50 years for that, because kind of these sorts of truth commissions and investigations just did not happen. So yeah, I definitely think there's a need to be wary. So my very quick question, really, there's loads I could ask about, was you had a chart that you never quite explained, and it had 1972 and 2001, and it totals and men. I just wondering what that referred to. So I was just really struck by that, and it didn't quite see the connection between the text or what you were saying. So just that. And just my final point was, as an assiduous attendee, it was quite the shock to see the new clean-shaven Andre. Anyway, I'll leave that as my final point. Thank you.
And the haircut, because I did that. That was my handiwork. Okay, maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. So we'll start with Jenny. Would you like to pick up on Grace's and Dara's question, and then we'll pass over to Francisco for closing remarks?
Well, to Grace's question, I know as much as you. I'm very frustrated at not being on the ground, and so I would love to know more about the level of organisation. So I'll do what Francisco said we could, which is to say, I desperate to know, but I don't know. And I just wanted to say that Urs was saying is because when he mentioned what happened with the Ballymore, with the recognition that the people who were killed by the British Army were actually totally innocent, it made me think that one thing we've left out is, which I think is one of the hopeful things, is the transitional justice process and the role of the HEP. And I'm not actually answering your question, but I just wanted to slip that in, because it seems to me that one of the creative things of the peace accord that is still, and it was the one thing you had in green, I think, Francisco, that's the one thing that's still there, and I really do think that this is a monumental importance that this survives, the HEP survives, and it's managed to so far. And it's still managing to do some really interesting things to get people to think very differently about transitional justice, which is what didn't happen in Northern Ireland. And so there's, something here from Colombia which could be incredibly important to thinking about peace anywhere. So I'm sorry, I just slipped that in.
Thank you, Jenny. Francisco.
Yeah, it's very important to defend the HEP. I completely agree, and it has done a lot of awesome things. No, responding to the table, I skipped it because I had limitations of time. I had to plug everything in half an hour. So basically, I simply didn't make it a focal point of attention. But basically, the idea was that there were like 4 arguments that you find in the sabotaging of the peace agreement in the 1960s, that peace agreement that Andre referred to, and I also, which surfaced in almost identical form now. First of all, that the reforms were pro-communist and would destroy private property. And this, of course, allowed a link between very conservative politicians and large landowners and sectors of the entrepreneurs. Second of all, that the guerrillas were not political, but they were bandits, and that they were simply looters in the case of the 1960s of the coffee economy, now rent seekers of the coca economy, so that they were simply criminals, and it was incredible to offer incentives to criminals. Third, this is verbatim in both cases. Third, that without peace there is no justice, and that the crimes of these criminals needed to be punished, and that not punishing them was an incentive for further criminality. And fourth, that the peace agreement went against development, basically giving the opportunity to occupy land and territory to backward peasants against productive entrepreneurs. This might sound like a caricature. It is not a caricature. Once again, it's almost verbatim, and it appeared in both peace processes in a very clear form. And yeah, let's say the kind of nice thing of the table, but I thought I could dispose of that in the interest of giving the most important arguments, was that I showed in the table that the guys that were speaking in the 1960s and the guys that were speaking in the 2020s were relatives. So they were simply the grandchildren of, or the grandnieces or of those who were speaking before. Yeah, so that was basically the idea. And regarding the mobilization, and once again, I would insist, I completely buy the idea of optimism of the will. Actually, and I was speaking with a colleague of mine who lives in Cali. We were speaking, look, this is a terrible moment, but also it's a quite exciting moment. This is a moment of a massive mobilization with a lot of innovations. I have not looked at this in detail, maybe because I have a bias toward horrible things, so I will try to counteract that bias. But what I know, the only thing that I can speak with certain knowledge is that, first of all, there is a big fracture between the Uribismo and the younger generation. So there's almost an inverse acceptance regarding age of the Uribismo. As you become younger, people are less enthusiastic about that thing. The young people, so there were kind of two young protagonists of this mobilization. On the one hand, people from the popular neighborhoods, the barrios, and on the other hand, people from the universities. And of course, they have an area of intersection, but they are different. Also, the trade unions, of course, played a protagonic role. Now, some agrarian organizations are joining. At the beginning, it was almost exclusively an urban movement. Some agrarian organizations have joined. Also, truck drivers. So it was an initial mobilization, and it became like the lightning rod, which attracted the ires and the frustration of different sectors. So it has been, to use yet another metaphor, like a kind of bola de nieve. How do you say that? I'm already tired.
Snowball.
Exactly, kind of snowball. So, and this snowballing is hugely interesting because it has meant like the kind of spontaneous dynamics of coming together of very different sectors that didn't speak before. A lot of traditional politicians are also supporting the thing, which is quite surprising, given the Colombian trajectory. I know, and I have spoken with some people about new forms of organization, but I haven't studied that in detail, so I can't. But let's say maybe we can speak afterwards with Andre or with Gwen, because I know people are producing a little bit in the move reflections about what is happening. And I think I will stop with that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Francisco, and thank you so much for giving your time in the midst of what I know is a very hectic moment in Colombia. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your energy and your ideas and your insights with us. And I'd just maybe make a couple of very brief closing comments before wrapping up. The first one is I think that the book, which I think I put in the chat, the link to buy it, and I do encourage everyone to buy it, very, very much is a call to be realistic that a new cycle of war in Colombia is at least highly possible, if not probable, at the time of writing, if actions were not taken to prevent all of the factors which you outline in the book. Yeah.
Gwen, may I interrupt you with a sentence in that note?
Yes, of course.
you guys can have a real influence in the change of discourse of the so-called international community, and that would be fundamental.
What would you like to see the international community say instead?
A little bit more of realism, that the bloody accord has to be implemented, that they will call the government for implementation, that that they have invested a lot of money after all in that.
We have been saying that, and I think that, you know, we will continue saying it, but you are quite right, it needs to be said very strongly, that the peace agreement absolutely needs to be implemented and respected. And I think that you know, it's very interesting having this conversation today after the outburst of the part of the strike in Colombia. And I think that one of the things it makes me think is that crisis, and Jenny has highlighted this as well, and so have you, Francisco, crisis is very much an opportunity and a crossroads. Colombia could go in so many different directions from here, and it's very unclear. We can just speculate at this stage what's going to happen. But I think that this is a crisis in among many other things, in the relationship between state and society, in the relationship between generations, in the relationship between left and right, the previous kind of categories across which divisions have been played out in Colombia over so many years, but in particular between state and society, because of the nature of the crisis being resulting partly from two very polarizing election results, 2016 and 2018, which Francisco has, of course, highlighted as key in the unfolding of today's problematic peace implementation or problematic peace situation. And I think that one way of looking to where things are going to go is, as the discussion went with Andre's question, looking towards what will happen in 2022. And I think really it's only in 2022 when the direction that the country will take is going to become clear, because it's going to be in that election when a new government is elected on a mandate, which will hopefully be clearer than the current government's mandate, because the government's mandate today was in fact to undermine the peace accord. They were elected on that basis, and so it's no surprise that the ambiguity with which they've been talking to the international community about implementing the peace accord in one way, but then behaving in a different way in the country. So I think that really I'm also left with the options of 2022 being either a return to more violence, which both Francisco and Jenny have really highlighted the very, very real dangers of, or an opportunity for a new form of social transformation, which is not really clear what form that would take yet, but certainly the mobilizations are a sign of effervescence, collective effervescence, which you know, we can read as hopeful in many ways. And also the importance, I think, of looking at the transitional justice institutions, the efforts being done by the HIP, and also the Truth Commission, which is going to release its report this year. And the hope that the space that has been held open for hope by those institutions, I think, is really important. And as academics, I think we can do a lot to stand by those institutions, stand by them, offer our privilege, our status, our name, to support them, and to recognize the good work that they're doing, and to repudiate the delegitimations of them in public media by many, including those currently in the government, and of course to repudiate the violence that is currently happening, in particular violence being done by state forces, and to repudiate in the strongest terms the militarization of cities and the militarized treatment of protesters. And so I think we can do small things in those ways. And it's been very encouraging to see the number of letters going around, both by Colombian academics and universities and foreign Colombianist scholars who are concerned about the current situation. And I think that does help in terms of calling attention to the international community and changing the discourse, as you say, Francisco, on how to interpret the current moment in Colombia and how to really see the urgency of the situation. But I think today has been a really fascinating discussion, and I go away with more questions than answers. But I'm extremely grateful to both Francisco and Jenny for their time, their thoughts. Francisco has emphasized in the chat that the book is available in paperback, so do buy it. And if anyone's going to Colombia, do bring back copies, because I know those of us here, we really want to be able to go to the Colombian bookshops and buy all the latest books. So thank you all very much for coming, everyone who stayed with us all this time. I would invite you all to turn on your cameras and open your microphones so we can give Francisco and Jenny a little round of applause to finish up today and to say thank you. We wish we could take you all out for drinks now, but we're also very happy to have you here across many countries. So thank you very much.
Thanks to all for your support.
Bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Ciao, thank you.